All right, and good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are located. Welcome to another episode of Patristicast. I'm your host, John Solheide. Delighted to have 5 guests on the show today to talk about a very fascinating project and a very fascinating figure, Evagrius Ponticus and his Gnostic Trilogy. I'll introduce the guests. Charles Stang is professor of early Christian thought and director of the Center for the Study of World Religions at Harvard Divinity School. Robin Darling-Young is a returning guest, associate professor of church history at Catholic University of America. Joel Kalvesmaki holds a fellowship at the Catholic University of America and is director of the Text Alignment Network. Father Columba Stewart, a monk at St. John's Abbey, just about 10 minutes down the road from where I am right now, professor of theology at the School of Theology at St. John's, and executive director of the Hill Museum and Monastic Library, or Hill Museum and Manuscript Library. Father Luke Dysinger, also a Benedictine monk, professor of church history and moral theology at St. John's Seminary in California. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
All right, so I thought we'd get started first with just a brief biographical sketch of Evagrius. Father Columba, you were the one who introduced me to Evagrius many years ago when I was a graduate student at the School of Theology. So I'm going to start with you, put you on the hot seat here. Who was Evagrius?
It's a very interesting question, John, and not an easy one to answer, because like most people from late antiquity, there are many mysteries in reconstructing the life of Evagrius and then different traditions that have arisen. But the short form would be, he is from northern Asia Minor, which we know from the fact that he was, given this geographical appellation of Ponticus, from Pontus. He went to Constantinople after having a very fine theological education from the luminaries in that sort of fluorescence of Cappadocian theology, heavily influenced by Origen, which of course becomes a problem for Evagrius later. He apparently is both intelligent and handsome, which that combination can often be dangerous, as legend suggests it was in Constantinople, where he was a deacon, I think having been ordained by Gregory Nazianzen, if I remember correctly. And so he's a deacon in Constantinople. He's very prominent in that public role. And at least one version of his biography suggests he got into a little bit of difficulty with a married woman of high status. And we don't know any details about what actually transpired, but it was sufficient to make him realize that his position in Constantinople had become untenable. And then in the received version, he has a dream one night in which he has been summoned before the judgment seat of God, and Christ there about to judge him. And basically the upshot is a deal is made. We often try to bargain with God. This one seems to have been settled amicably on both sides. And the deal was, if he were to leave Constantinople, in other words, get out of this situation, which was obviously very bad for him, then it would be okay. He wouldn't be hauled up on a charge of adultery. He wouldn't have to deal with the husband of the woman who had threatened legal action. And if I remember correctly, in the dream was also present as somebody accusing him. So off he goes, probably to Jerusalem. Initially, maybe he stopped somewhere else along the way. And it is there that he met the extraordinary Melania and has a crisis there as well, continuing some of the same elements of the previous one, but also finding the woman who would, in effect, become a new spiritual master for him after having had the benefit of Gregory Nazianzen and so on in his original location. So I think we should turn to Professor Robin Darling-Young to tell us about Melania. What may have transpired in Jerusalem.
Thank you. I have very significant doubts about the veracity of the standard biography. I don't need to go into that for the moment, only to say that I think there's probably more to the story about Constantinople, and it may not have been a woman, it might have been money, but I have a good reason for saying that. We can get back to it if we need to. The person that he encountered, who in this biography by Palladius, which is behind, is the sort of accepted standard biography, although it is a hagiography, the woman Melania functions as Mary to the Eve of the woman in Constantinople. And she is the one who is going to conduct his anabasis to heaven via the monastic route. She is, at the moment she went to Jerusalem, she was the wealthiest person in the Roman Empire. That's significant. She founded a school devoted to Origenian studies, which was divided into male and female, the male part headed by Rufinus, the female part presumably headed by herself. And that seems to have been Evagrius's anchor to windward in Jerusalem, which was not a retreat center at the time, let's put it that way. It was another bustling city, doubtless with its bawdy corners. And she was the one who suggested that he be clothed in the monastic robe. And in the story, she quite unusually clothes him herself and then sends him off to Egypt, where he has a period of time as a kind of postulant, we would now say, and then achieves his own solitude, where he begins his career of writing, teaching, and supports himself by copying manuscripts. That's all in the story by Palladius. I, of course, invite anybody else to add anything at this point. The problem with this is, and this is actually where I think Joel has something new to add right now, since he's just published an article on the subject. The problem with that is that the standard version, based on this hagiography by Palladius, assumes that he wrote nothing until he gets to the desert, at which point he was furiously and in a holy way very productive. So I pass it to Joel for a correction.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I've put out an argument in the December 2023 issue of the Journal of Early Christian Studies, JEX, that the Kephalaia Gnostica, which we'll be getting to in a little bit, is not the third and last part of a trilogy written at a discrete time. Rather, the Kephalaia Gnostica was written in the 370s when Evagrius was still in the environs of Gregory Nazianzus. And later, when he went to the desert, he repackaged the KG by prepending two works, the Praktikos and the Gnostikos, and circulated that. So the Kephalaia Gnostica actually represents a middle phase of Evagrius' career. Remember, when he was in there in the 370s, he wasn't necessarily young. He was born in 345. So he was in his 30s and his prime of life, and presumably was already busy as a writer. We see from the polish of his prose that he spent a lot of time working very hard and carefully at his rhetoric. And I believe this just opens up a way of rethinking about the literary corpus of Evagrius. Perhaps there are other writings that were conducted during this period, and we can distinguish between his pre-monastic writing career and his in-monastic writing career.
Could I jump in and just add
Yes, please.
I was aware of Joel's argument before it was published in this most recent issue of JEX, and it served as the occasion for a seminar I taught on the Gnostic Trilogy in 2022-23, and I used Joel's argument that the KG were actually earlier 370s as the kind of premise for the course, so that you don't read the KG only after the Praktikos and the Gnostikos, but we introduced it right away and started thinking about what would this text be if Joel is right that it's early. Not only how does it change our reading of the KG themselves, but then how does it change our reading of these two prepended texts that, in a sense, hold it differently in a new monastic context. So I find Joel's proposal fascinating, and I tried it on for a year. But I can say more about that later.
Yeah, Joel, we talked very briefly at NAPS this year, and the paper I gave there was on the Philokalia of origin, and when and who were the likely compilers, because that's usually attributed to Basil of Caesarea and Gregory Nazianzen. And talking to you gave me some inspiration for why I think we might be able to keep that attribution if Evagrius is hanging out with Gregory, whom he mentions quite frequently in at least the Gnostica, but I think probably also the Kephalaia Gnostica. I can't remember exactly, but there are several references to Gregory in there. And so you have Evagrius, in these philosophical and theological conversations with Basil and Gregory Nazianzen, like a little network of friends, having these literary pursuits together. So I thought that was it's a very intriguing argument, because so the Gnostic Trilogy, I suppose we should introduce here, might be kind of good, contains the Praktikos, the Gnostikos, and the Kephalaia Gnostica. And these have historically been read as a gradual progression in kind of monastic formation, where you start with the Praktikos and then you end in the contemplative delights of the Kephalaia Gnostica. But I think what you guys are saying is perhaps, even if I think you guys say this in the introduction, even if Evagrius intended perhaps the Praktikos and the Gnostikos to be read before the Kephalaia Gnostica, if I'm getting you right in what you said there in the introduction, that doesn't preclude the possibility that the KG was written first, and then he came back later and wrote the other two. Right. So let's talk about this, because Evagrius is, a dominating figure in the 4th century. He dies in 399, so right at about the outbreak of the first Origenist crisis, of which, as Elizabeth Clark, I think, has argued quite persuasively, that he played a pretty central role in that crisis. But because he fell into his own problems linked with Origen, his texts, not all of his texts, in fact, most do not survive in their original Greek in their entirety. So in this trilogy, there's Greek, there's various Syriac versions, and are there not Armenian translations as well? So let's talk about how, just the project itself, where did it come from, and how difficult was it to collect all these different sources and determine whether or not they were Evagrian, and just the different translation issues you guys faced? I don't know who would like to begin that, but Father Luke, you haven't chimed in yet. So
I haven't chimed in, but I will certainly leave it to the Syriac experts to describe the manuscript traditions. I merely wanted to suggest to Robin that we ought to at least mention a meeting that I vaguely recall quite a long time ago in the Eagle and Child pub at Oxford, where I think much of this was mooted. So there are a variety of proto-preparations for the work that might be mentioned.
Well, there were actually a series. So Columba blames it on me and I blame it on him. And I'm going to keep blaming it on him, the idea for this thing, because we were both at a Syriac symposium at Duke University in 2011. And Columba said to me, or I said to him, it's disputed, why don't we translate the Gnostic, translate whatever we called it at the time, translate the trilogy? And I said, oh, great idea. And we had a meeting, our first meeting at Catholic University, where I think in the Semitic department, where I think we fell to quarreling, and we continued, but that's a sign of life, you know. We continued quarreling, you know, for years. But we did have a discussion also at the Eagle and Child, and this was a movable feast, so to speak, where we met in various places to work on the translation, with insight dawning along the way. I hope it was increasing insight, we, I think, really didn't discuss much Joel's thesis, which I believe is persuasive, because we didn't discuss very much the other works of Evagrius, and where they stand in the evolution of his thought. So, for instance, we didn't discuss the Scholia collection, which interpretations of the wisdom literature that he writes. When? We don't know. But the interesting thing about those is that, like the Kephalaia Gnostica, I believe this to be true, that all three of them mention the word monachos, or solitary, or monk, once. And I think, isn't it true, Joel, that the Kephalaia Gnostica mentions it only once? So possibly an indication of having been written at an earlier stage before he made that particular move.
Right.
And they're part of, and I think everyone would agree with me, but obviously, you know, I think they're part of his effort to bring the philosophy, Christian philosophy, of Clement of Alexandria and Origen, and then more remote in time, Philo and the Septuagint, not Christian, but adopted by Christians, into the period at the end of the 4th century, which is a really crucial period for the development of Christian institutions and Christian thinking. So I take him as very self-consciously trying to bring forward the tradition of the Gnostikos, the one who knows, as a teacher in the Christian world. A teacher at several levels, at the beginning level, at the middle level, and at the highest level. And that matches Clement and Origen very well.
I think this also touches on the ambivalence in the monastic tradition about his writings.
Yes.
And the fact that Kephalaia Gnostica basically vanishes, partly for concerns about, you know, the imputed Origenism, but partly because nobody could understand it. Whereas Praktikos was very accessible, you know, the teaching on the 8 thoughts, incredibly useful. A prominent American Benedictine, who is now an abbot, whose name I will not mention, who has translated some of Evagrius. I once asked him, so what do you think about the Kephalaia Gnostica anyway? And he said, I wish he'd never written the damn thing. But he was speaking as somebody involved in monastic formation, for which it seemed probably irrelevant. So I think, Robin, your point about he's deliberately trying to change Egyptian monastic culture, at least in the Greek-speaking part of it, by introducing this program is quite interesting. And it had a certain success later in Palestine, but ultimately, I guess, failed, except through the back door in various other ways.
Well, there's a really interesting confirmation of that. I think you probably know that I'm working with the Armenian versions of Evagrius. I have a student who's doing a critical edition of the Praktikos and Gnostikos, but the Armenians knew that this was a trilogy, but instead of translating the Kephalaia Gnostica in the 6th century, as they did those other 2 works, to make a trilogy, they translated the On Prayer. And so that was a trilogy, Gnostikos, Praktikos, On Prayer. And they also kind of toned it down a little bit sometimes, but, you know, this is what happens. These the tradition, whatever that means, can't really absorb, doesn't have an easy place for the Kephalaia Gnostica,
That's
or
right.
for that matter, something Charlie's working on, I think, right? The Great Letter,
Mhm.
or the
Mhm.
Letter to Melania.
Yep.
They make sense. And I'll just throw this out as a possibility because I'm in the middle of translating the Contra Kelsum right now. They make sense as a continuing response to late Platonist philosophy
Mhm.
in the Christian vein.
Mhm.
And this has been going on from Clement forward to make a compelling case for a philosophy that is Christian, a genuine philosophy that is genuinely Christian. And I think Evagrius is part of that project, and I think Didymus is too.
Mhm.
Mm.
And I think it's kind of ends at the, in the 5th century, it's kind of over.
So can I? Oh, I'm sorry, Father Luke. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think Joel's thesis is particularly interesting when one considers as well that another phenomenon that strangely historians of music have particularly emphasized concerns the fact that it was in the latter 4th century that the phenomenon of psalmody as phenomenal as basic to monasticism really begins to appear, and that's also true in the so-called cathedral tradition, but it's especially true in monasticism. Suddenly monks are praying the psalms. They are praying the psalms, and Athanasius is explaining, well, why, what are they supposed to mean? Why are we supposed to be doing this? In a sense, the older way of, again, considering Joel's thesis, of regarding the Scholia on Psalms, which is, by the way, his longest work. It's the most extensive thing he wrote. It's incredible that he spent as much time finding practical, or if you will, ascetical, and also contemplative dimensions to different words in almost all 150 Psalms. It's very intriguing that in a way, what one perhaps could see, again, using Joel's thesis, is that Evagrius is attempting to take this phenomenon of psalmody, which could simply be a form of ascetical grinding through because God wants us to grind through it, and instead enabling it to become something that could be actually a window into eternity. That is, the Psalter can become a way of looking at the mysteries of how my own soul is growing, how the universe is evolving into a relationship with God. And so in a sense, one begins to say that the Scholia on Psalms are a peppering into the phenomenon of psalmody, of this deeper insight that everything is deeply interconnected. Everything leads us into a sense of closer relationship with God. So traditionally one would say, well, he's writing all these Scholia on Psalms, and then he kind of puts together some of them in the Kephalaia Gnostica. I think Joel's idea is very significant because in many ways, what one has in the Scholia is a way of taking this phenomenon of psalmody and enabling it to sparkle and shine in a way that it otherwise wouldn't.
I have to add at this point, because this article is just about to appear, I tracked Evagrius's Scholia on Psalm 76 in relation to Origen's homily on Psalm 76 in the newly discovered homilies. It tracks verse for verse with what Origen says until he gets to the last verse, and then he quotes Clement. It's fascinating.
Robin, I want to touch on something you said just prior about Christian philosophy. So at the time of Evagrius, there were some prominent Neoplatonists. Porphyry might have been pretty old. He might have even been dead by the time
Probably
Evagrius was writing. But certainly there were you had Emperor Julian, correct? And Gregory was fighting with him. Iamblichus, was Iamblichus alive at this time, or was he was dead as well?
Probably dead. They may have overlapped when Evagrius was a young boy, but he was gone by then. But the school wasn't gone. There were still, and it seems likely to me that Evagrius would have encountered late Platonists of the late variety when he himself was a schoolboy in Pontus, because we know they were teaching up there. So it's not as, philosophy and theology are not divided in this period the way they were thanks to the 13th century in the West. We'll say no more about that. But I think it's impossible to think of Evagrius being able to do what he did without having an education in Platonist philosophy. which he could get from non-Christian Platonists, but also from Christian Platonists, like the Gregories, for instance.
So I'm going to turn it over to Joel now, because Joel, you have a little screen that you want to share with us to kind of highlight some of the complexities of working through this translation project. You want to go ahead and take that away for a few minutes? You're muted.
You're muted.
We've left a number of threads open in this discussion. We were already going in a lot of places. One of those discussions was about how the project even got started and its complexity. I'm an editor of an online resource. It's called The Guide to Evagrius Ponticus, and it's something I update every year. It's intended to be a comprehensive, authoritative reference on the works and life of Evagrius. There's a life section, a bibliography, a work checklist. Also included in that are an accumulating number of actual editions of Evagrius's work, which I'm now displaying here. In the case of the Kephalaia Gnostica, what you're seeing here are a panoply of versions. You'll see a little bit of Greek. I've moved this to 584 and down to 588, and you see that we sometimes do have Greek fragments for the Kephalaia Gnostica. In fact, there is about 25% of the Kephalaia Gnostica that's attested in Greek fragments. We have the two Syriac versions known as S1 and S2. S1 is often described as the boulderized version of Evagrius's work, whereas S2 is a much more literal rendering of the Greek. It doesn't take too much work to see that S2 is much more close to the Greek that survives than S1 is. 9 times out of 10, the Greek comports with S2 against S1 when there are differences. Actually, more than that. This particular version also has a little bit of Greek. It says S1 FR. This is because an important scholar named Frankenberg released an edition of the Syriac material, and he attempted a Greek retroversion of said material. It was only S1 that he released in this case. And then in the far right column is a translation by Father Luke, integrated into it with reflecting his understanding of S2. This does not collate our translation in the Oxford edition, which is under copyright, but you still have the material you need to get started on your own research. And we had raised the issue of monk, and this is kind of why I've shown you this material, because in 586 you'll see that there's one instance of monk, which Frankenberg clearly retroducts as monachos. Ichidoio is the Syriac word in both S1 and S2. But the Greek fragment that we have, which is from an anonymous collection, does not have the word monk. It has, there's a typo there, kenodoxos, the one who is empty of, I'm sorry, that isn't a typo. That was just a spot on my screen. The one who is empty of glory. This is the sort of thing that would raise questions among ourselves. What is the Greek to be trusted here? Because in some cases the Greek is clearly different. If the parallel comes from the Scholion Psalms, there's a good chance that it differs in important ways, because they represent two occasions of writing for the same idea, and Evagrius opted to choose a different trajectory for each saying in each occasion. Other times, such as this, where it's coming from a Byzantine compilation, it's much more likely that the original is preserved. But you still then have to explain how is it that both S1 and S2 have this monachos? How do you get there? And our conversations in the various cities we met in, which I believe included Chicago, I should go by states, I think Illinois, California, New Jersey, Washington, D.C. We spent hours and hours wrangling over very, very difficult textual issues that revolved around single words or single phrases.
So just a question for clarification. So kenodoxos, the one who is empty of glory, and monachos, these are from the same text, or are these different Greek texts? Is Evagrius using two different words here to describe this individual, or is this maybe a copyist who changed it sometime later?
We don't know. There must have been some editorial hand at work.
So
when you want to jump in, Charlie?
no, go ahead, Joe, please.
I was just going to say that when you see the rubric here, GRC-FP, or it's a siglum, that's actually Fourier Piliod, and the lion's share of Greek fragments come from this edition of what I call the definitions and descriptions. It's a Byzantine collection of about 2,000 definitions, and about 13% of the Kephalaia Gnostica is preserved in this, and it by and large is spot on exact. So if you're going to doubt whether the Greek is true here, you should probably have a pretty good reason, because there's a good track record in the definitions and descriptions for accuracy. That said, we know that Evagrius wrote it something once, or maybe he wrote a second edition. That's always a possibility. We need to keep that in mind. Just like he did the Praktikos. The Praktikos was originally only 90 chapters, and they needed a second edition that had a full 100 chapters. Perhaps there's something in the Kephalaia Gnostica tradition that just has not survived in the historical record, where he did 90 per century and then later did 100 per century, or I know that's getting a little bit speculative, but I just want to at least leave open the possibility that there's a lot of editorial history we're not privy to. So the editorial change could have been by Evagrius' own hand in another version, or it could have been by the scribes in the Jerusalem monasteries. I think that they play a key role in the transmission and survival of these texts, especially into Syriac, because there isn't any better candidate to suggest, or somebody later on in the tradition. It's very difficult to say.
So I think for your readers' sake, John, what might be worth highlighting is that in both versions of the Kephalaia Gnostica of 586 that Joel has brought us to, the word that we have here is ihidaya, which means the single one in Syriac. That is almost always translating monachos, or solitary one in Greek. And yet, as Joel has said, when this is a case in which we have a Greek fragment that we that's fairly credible, and yet it's this different word. Why? And one of the significances, one aspect of the significance of this is it comes back to the question as to whether the Kephalaia Gnostica are in fact monastic texts, because they don't use. We have reason to doubt that even here, we think this is a mention of a monk, is actually not a mention of a monk. So again, it's back to Joel's thesis that the Kephalaia Gnostica are a text that predate the monastic period. And I just want to come back to something I think Robin said earlier, which is that, or maybe it was Joel, that there's something unassimilable or undigestible about the Kephalaia Gnostica in the subsequent monastic tradition. Actually, something Columba said too, that both of these translations are themselves, in a sense, attempts to digest this bizarre text in a monastic tradition. S1 is clearly trying to soften some of the wild edges of the Kephalaia for a very different Syriac monastic audience. And we have commentaries on the Kephalaia Gnostica that have survived in Syriac. And you can see there too, they're very concerned about how this will read from a monastic context, which, when it combined that fact with Joel's hypothesis or proposal, it suggests to me that the Kephalaia Gnostica are wild, and they ultimately, in some sense, you could say, well, I'm going to put this as a question to my collaborators here. Evagrius's attempt to shoehorn them into a monastic frame fails, because two ways. One, the tradition clearly just doesn't know what to do with them and largely ignores them, as Columba said, including a contemporary abbot who wishes that Evagrius had never written them. Or the commentary tradition tries to keep them, tries to kind of frame them in such a way that they can continue to be edifying. But I wonder, I mean, it's a provocative question, I suppose, it's just to say, are the Kephalaia Gnostica just unassimilable in a monastic context?
Or maybe are they kind of one of the last vestiges of an attempt to take seriously the ancient tradition of purely gnomic literature, where you have wisdom sayings, but very difficult to interpret kinds of wisdom sayings, which Christianity attempted to incorporate, say, the sentences of Sextus and a variety of other collections. Evagrius is clearly borrowing from that, is clearly modeling himself on that tradition. And yet one might wonder, the unassimilable aspect of this then results in, instead, the quasi-gnomic literature that survives are the sayings of the Desert Fathers, that you instead take reliable statements attributable to people that you believe you can trust. And those are the rather wild and wacky collections that do survive, not the rather more perplexing ones. It's almost as if there's a kind of an orthodox layering over material, which if you can then connect it with someone trustworthy, you can more or less make sense.
Yeah, it seems to me that the gnomic quality of the Kephalaia Gnostica is a different gnomic quality than the apophthegmata patrum. And I think you're right that there's a good reason why the apophthegmata traditions survived and continued to be edifying for monastic readership, and apparently the Kephalaia largely did not.
But there's an important point here that we haven't addressed so far, strangely, and that is the title, Gnostic. Now, that word is the third rail of theology after Clement. Origen avoids it like crazy. He doesn't want to hear it. Clement's whole work is meant to, I'm exaggerating, but let's just, for the sake of discussion, Clement's entire labor in his trilogy is to wrest the word Gnostikos away from dualists and restore it to non-dualist Platonic Christianity, such that the Gnostikos is the sage who guides the Christian assembly. I think I'm not exaggerating about that. Why does Evagrius go back and pick up that third rail and call the master, the sage, either the sage of Christian philosophers or the sage of solitaries, the Gnostikos? He doesn't tell us. Characteristically, he doesn't tell us, but he does it, and it's really important. And he may have been, and I think Joel and I have found some indications of this when we were preparing the footnotes, that he may have been trying to ward off the other attractive celibate teachers of Egypt that would have been the Manichaeans. Okay, it's wrong to look for a communist under every bed. I know that, but there seemed to be, weren't there 12, Joel, that we thought were direct responses to identifiable Manichaean literature circulating in Egypt? And we know that other teachers of that period were very worried about Manichaean teaching and the Manichaean mission, not to mention his eminence to the West, Augustine. Pause for respect. And what that is one of the reasons that I think Evagrius is so insistent upon taking care of the body, the vehicle of your salvation, versus dualists. And he's so interested in showing how to make the anabasis back out of cosmos and aeon toward the aidios, the timeless realm of God, which is certainly in what you're working on, Charlie, right? So Gnostikos that's dangerous. And far from being a modest and chastened thinker, it strikes me that if a guy is willing to use the word Gnostikos as, flagrantly as he used it, he's pretty confident in himself. Of course, Theophilus didn't like him, but so what? A bishop doesn't like a smart guy? That's never happened before.
Well, and Robin, you've pointed out as well that whereas Evagrius is eventually condemned as an Origenist, and people still seem to think of him in those terms, he's really more of a Clementine than an Origenist.
Absolutely. But Clement was so he himself is so deliberately mysterious and obscure, and he's so overshadowed by the hyperactive Origen that he kind of, he doesn't ever get condemned. It's as if someone just forgot. So
he doesn't write as clearly gnomic literature, but if you try to read Clement, you do have a sense that this man is going all over the place constantly. In a sense, if you divided it up into separate sentences, it would almost look like Evagrius.
Absolutely. And he often stops a sentence and doesn't give you the last and important clause, presumably because he has already told his students orally. So, and by the way, I have to add just quickly that Babai the Great, one of Evagrius's fans in East Syria, asked the question, where were those 10 missing Kephalaia in each century? And he said, they're in heaven.
Nice.
So this actually, I think, is a good segue for us to briefly talk about the texts and what's in them. Now, Evagrius, I have something here. Let's see. Where do I start? So again, we're dealing with 3 different texts, the Praktikos, the Gnostikos, and the Kephalaia Gnostica. Let's see. So Evagrius, or someone, doesn't want copyists to make any adjustments to the arrangement. He wants them to keep it all the same. Don't move things around. Quote, we begin the first Kephalaia from what is Christianity, which, in our defining, we have given to be the teaching of Jesus Christ our Savior, consisting of the practical, the natural, and the theological, end quote. So is that him outlining what this trilogy is about? The first book is about practical knowledge, or practice, perhaps ascetic practice. The second is about knowledge of the natural world. And then the third, the Kephalaia Gnostica, is this theological or contemplative knowledge. Is that what he's setting out here? Or what does he mean when Christianity consists of the practical, the natural, and the theological? I don't know who wants to take that one away.
Could I just add a footnote to your comment about copyists? And that is what I find really interesting about that note to copyists is his insistence not only on keeping the arrangement as such, but specifying that each of the chapters is to be written on its own line.
Mhm.
You don't turn it into a massive text, but you present it pedagogically as that gnomic statement or less gnomic statement, because they're not all difficult to interpret, so that you take it in one at a time. And I think that gives us an insight into both Evagrius, the teacher, personally, but also the tradition of pedagogy into which he's inserting himself. So, pardon me for that aside, but now we get to your very fine question.
I don't think I'm sorry, Luke, did you want to take this question up about the
Mm,
trilogy?
Just
The
a very
tripart?
brief,
Go ahead.
just a very brief observation that one's not describing the Praktikos as asceticism, the Gnostikos as contemplation of nature, or because after all, theologia in the strict sense of talking about the divine nature is something you find very seldom in his writings and really only in the letter to the Trinity. So he's describing a model, a pedagogical model of how one understands everything and how everything is related, and a kind of a notion of how we move towards an appreciation of everything before he then talks about the books themselves.
So that tripartite pedagogy doesn't map exactly onto the trilogy, John, in answer to your question. That is to say, another way to talk about the curriculum is that there's practice, praktike, and then there's contemplation or theoria. And under theoria, you have both natural and theological contemplation. And then, so that's the kind of monastic curriculum, or then the question becomes, well, how does that translate into these three texts? And I'd say the standard view, and I invite anyone to challenge this, I might challenge it myself, but is to say that the Praktikos is largely devoted to, ordering yourself, staving off the 8 demon thoughts, such that one can achieve a state of freedom from passion, apatheia, which with which comes agape or love. I'm drawing this from the letter to Anatolios, which is prepended to the trilogy. And once a monk has accomplished this, he earns the title Gnostikos, a knower, and is authorized to teach, to guide others. And crossing that threshold of freedom from passion and love means one enters into the stage of theoria, which again has these two sides, natural theoria and then theoria of the Holy Trinity. My own sense is that the Gnostikos as a text is about this transitional stage. What does it mean to take up the position of the guide, of the sage, to use the term that Robin mentioned earlier? And then the Kephalaia Gnostica have ample, they contain sentences that are meant to spurn both natural and theological contemplation.
I think one also needs to avoid a kind of I won't call it an error, but definitely a tendency that exists, I think, especially in the West, to imagine that there's a sort of a threefold step, that you spend a certain amount of your life in purgation, a certain amount of your time appreciating the wisdom of creation, and then somehow towards the end of your life, simply blissing out on God, perceiving the divine mysteries. And the reality is they are deeply intertwined. And this is something that Evagrius makes a point of over and over again, that even at the end of life, you will continue to be afflicted by this demon or this demon, and therefore you'll need to constantly be in quest of virtue. So I think one would have to say that it's really a question of a kind of you might say, a different colors of a spectrum that come together, but none of which is ever present in an absolutely pure form.
Right, I agree.
And I think that this is where it's important to remember how pervasive the biblical text is.
Yeah.
So we mentioned earlier the scholia. That's really the job of the Gnostikos, is to interpret the scriptures for the beginner or the middling monk in light of these basic principles of Evagrius and that tradition. And even the Kephalaia Gnostica, the scripture pervades along with all this other stuff. But it's very clear that in the Gnostikos, that's the number one job of the teacher, is unlocking the meaning of the text that the monks recite and hear all the time. And that's what we see in the Scholi, and that's why the Scholi are so rich, because you kind of see it, sur le vif, like you see it happening right in front of you. And, they're literary, of course, but also you see, to a certain extent, enacted the work of the Gnostikos. And that's really fascinating.
Yeah.
I like to think of the trilogy as better thought of as Praktikos, Kephalaia Gnostica, then Gnostikos, because the Gnostikos is written under the assumption that the reader has already mastered the material in the Kephalaia Gnostica and has facility in it. And now, what do they do with it? How do they lead others? How do they teach?
I think it's really important. Oh, I'm sorry, Joel.
Sorry. That's my thought.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I think it's really important to note, and Luke has traced this out in a document. I don't know if it's on your website or not, but how much of the Kephalaia Gnostica is devoted to making the reader think about the true priesthood in a very encoded and interesting way we don't have time to go into. But the word that he uses that we've translated, and I'm unhappy with this now, in our translation as Christianity, is really Christianismos, which in Greek signifies the Christian way, like the Hellenic way or the Jewish way. There's also the Christian way. So who are the other people who use this term? Ignatius, Clement, and Origen. So that is Christianismos. So it actually means a path, not a building, not a shadow government, not a diocese, but a path. And this path has the stages that my colleagues have been speaking about so well, but the force of the word is movement, that it is movement toward, not establishment of. And I think that's actually one of the reasons that Evagrius might not have been useful in the later tradition until he was sort of divvied up and reinterpreted, because he's really moving against the tide of post-Theodosian Christianity, which is very much Christendom, an establishment. Yeah, so that's my point about that.
I like the emphasis you placed on the notion of a path, because he himself talks about the signs that you will see along the path, and which enables you to then interpret more clearly the material that comes afterwards. And indeed, there's the mysterious, well, depending on the text, but the version you're using, but the mysterious conclusion, scrutinize these texts according to the number of the 6 days of creation. The path of the individual is mysteriously mirrored by the path of creation itself. Everything is moving in a direction towards union with God, and get with the program. That's as true of you as it is of the universe itself. And there are wonderful correlates that one can perceive in between. And I very much appreciated the point that was just made, that the Kephalaia Gnostica really is the textbook. Well, it's a kind of a lens through which you see the real textbook. And as Columba pointed out, the foundational textbook is the scriptures. It's the way of unlocking the mysteries of the biblical text that then enable them to, as I was saying before, kind of glisten and sparkle in a way that enables you to see your path more clearly.
Can we talk a little bit about that? Because in the Gnostikos, he brings up Moses, and the commandments have an intrinsic connection with the laws of nature. And it seems like he's drawing on Philo there, because doesn't Philo open his allegorical interpretation of the creation, saying that Moses did that deliberately? He places these laws are established but these laws reflect something about the natural order of the universe. And it seems like Evagrius is drawing on that philosophical tradition here.
Very much so.
And is that perhaps a bit of a response to the Manichaeans and their dualism?
The Kephalaia of the teacher is a little bit earlier than Evagrius's Kephalaia Gnostica.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that could be post hoc propter hoc, which is logically problematic, but it's suggestive, right?
Mm-hmm.
But with regard to the connection with Philo, I think the connection between Evagrius and Gregory of Nyssa can be overstated. One can see Gregory of Nyssa everywhere. But in fact, there is, of course, a connection. And Gregory of Nyssa is, well, plagiarizing would be a very strong word, but he certainly is very dependent on Philo for his understanding of the spiritual journey and for how one interprets the books of Moses.
Mm-hmm.
So
maybe can we just, I think for your readers, for your listeners' sake, we might want to just say a little bit of something about what Robin, the text she just referred to. So it goes back to her proposal that Evagrius might be responding to Manichaeism. We have a text that survives from Egypt in Coptic called the Kephalaia of the teacher here referring to Mani himself. It doesn't look exactly like Evagrius's Kephalaia. They're more like short essay teachings. But that just to say, for those of your listeners who aren't familiar with 4th century Manichaeism in Egypt, that's what Robin is referring to. The title, and the title both of the Kephalaia and that of the teacher may help us think about it. Evagrius responding not as Clement was to the quote-unquote Gnostics, but a different kind of a new version of dualism that was attracting people in Egypt in the 4th century.
So I think
I'm sorry, Columba.
I was just going to say this is really crucial because the very successful extirpation of the Manichaeans in the Middle East and in the Greek world shrouds for us the understanding that they were a potent and numerous force, and particularly that they had ascetics, the elite or the elect in the Manichaeans, who were perceived by many of the Christian writers as direct competitors to the monastic movement, to the point that it was observed, they fast like us, they dress simply like us, but everything they do is based on a lie. Whereas from a popular perception, it looked like the Manichaean elect did it better. It's like pure asceticism. It was easier to understand what was going on. It was played out in their rituals. I remember Peter Brown on a couple of occasions. He came to hear a couple of talks that I gave, and on both times, he tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Columba, don't forget the Manichaeans." When Peter Brown tells you something once, you should listen, but when he tells you twice, you really have to listen. And so I went through a kind of Manichaean phase, neither theologically nor personally, and it completely changed my perspective on a lot of both the Syriac stuff and the Egyptian stuff.
Absolutely, yeah.
They were on every corner. They were direct competitors. So,
can we say something about their form of dualism for people who might watch and not understand what that word really means? We're talking like a spirit matter kind of dualism, right? Where matter, corporeality was somehow kind of
they're like the they are in some ways the purest dualists of late antiquity, because their dualism derives from a cosmic dualism of two eternal warring realms, the realm of light and the realm of darkness, which have become, through an elaborate, almost Baroque mythology that they supply, have become mixed in the world in which we find ourselves. And then out of that comes a kind of dualist ethic of separating out the light particles that are unevenly distributed through this world and returning them to the source. So it's in some sense a a dualist ethic of separation, trying to restore, retrieve as much of the light as possible. So that's but it translates into a kind of sexual abstinence and very elaborate alimentary regime, what you can and can't eat. But that program of abstinence and asceticism, as Columba said, is undertaken not by everyone, but by an elect on behalf of the whole church of Manichaeans. Is that a fair summary, colleagues?
That's good, but just one footnote to it. In their sacred meal, which is where a lot of this transaction happened, which enabled the catechumens or hearers, the kind of ordinary lay people, to gain access to the light, the ascetics were front and center. And so the ordinary Manichaean was having regular contact with the ascetic elect in a way that was not comparable to the Christian side, where monks were a lot of places, but they weren't at the heart of the most sacred ritual. And again, the parallelism with Eucharist, the kind of spectacle of seeing these gaunt people eating on your behalf and sharing these things, you can see why particularly monastic writers and ascetic writers, I mean, Ephraim and others, viewed this as a very dangerous threat.
And maybe it's worth saying also that the Manichaeans claimed to be the true church, and they understood themselves, or at the very least marketed themselves as the true Christians.
Manny, apostle of Jesus Christ.
Yeah, and I think it's also important, and it's important for understanding Evagrius too, that the Manichaeans came from another world. They came from the world of Persia, and they incorporated Zoroastrianism, certain Buddhist elements, and they brought it west. And it really scared people in the Western Imperium. Some people liked it, Augustine, but some people were really terrified by it. But it points to the relatively easy transmission of ideas across borders, in which, and that's a situation in which Evagrius himself is functioning, where what's going on in Syria, what's going on in Persia, what's going on in Armenia or in the Upper Nile, it's not unknown to everyone. Is communicating across these linguistic and geographical lines.
So Evagrius develops the very sophisticated, I don't know what we might call like a moral psychology, where he describes the relationships between our thoughts, the way we think about things or perceive things, various stimuli that kind of instigate these responses. Is that developing against the backdrop of these Manichaeans and their kind of dualism? Is Evagrius trying to create a balance with that? Because he doesn't just blame everything on the body or on matter. Maybe just a question, what is this relationship between thoughts, stimuli, our moral choices that Evagrius is developing here? Because he talks about these logismoi, these kind of intrusive or bad thoughts that get converted into Latin by Gregory the Great, I think, right, into the 7 deadly sins. What's going on here with Evagrius's psychology?
I think one thing one needs to say at the outset, especially given the prominence of his use of the term apatheia, is that by the patheia, it means something very different from anything we would use in English that corresponds to that term. He refers to something that is receptive, something that becomes, you might say, passive. Probably the closest we can get to the notion of the logismoi or one's giving into patheia is our current fascination with the notion of addiction and compulsion, that the point at which freedom is lost and the individual becomes, you might say, a vessel for something else acting upon it. That's his notion of the danger we're constantly in. And the goal is to seek the balance that enables one to constantly be free, to be capable of making actual choices and not constantly be subjected to a pressure that makes one into almost an automaton.
There's a strong psychosomatic element behind the theory of the passions, and I think most people, when they read the Praktikos, they're struck by the kinds of physical observations that Evagrius makes. It shows up in some of his other works as well. So he saw this as somehow deeply connected, and he was well read in the literature of his day that surrounding medicine and other theories, and he probably gleaned a number of other observations from the ascetics he met when he was in Egypt. So you have that. You have another aspect that I think is really appreciated very much. We talk about his theory of the passions, but it's the very same term that is used by Aristotle in his categories, and he's very acquainted and happy with the Aristotelian language. Yet somehow when we translate Aristotle, we don't talk about him discussing the passions. We talk about emotions. I'm not proposing that we actually use the same terms in both, but it's lost on the reader that Evagrius is working with paradigms that he's inherited and running with them and adjusting them. And one really needs to understand that there's a technical background behind his theory of the passions that does really nicely equate to this Aristotelian view of the pathe, the things that are acted upon in your interior life, whether that gets translated as emotion or passion or some other English word.
Does he develop like Didymus does, and Origen a little bit before them, the notion of pre-passion or propadia? And does he distinguish between that somewhat automatic response to a stimulus and a passion if one kind of gives in to the pre-passion? Does he get into that much?
It's not a technical term he uses.
Okay.
The place where, if you want to read a vivid description, there is a treatise called On Thoughts, where he discusses in a very striking way the action of the thoughts, or really calculating thoughts, on a person with ambition. It's creepy, actually.
All right. Well, we've been going for almost an hour and 20 minutes, so I thought I'd wrap up with one final question. Joel and Robin, you guys edited a book called Evagrius and His Legacy. So I thought I would end with that question. This is we'll go around the horn here. Robin, you're in my top left. I'll start with you and go clockwise, I guess. What is Evagrius's legacy?
Evagrius, in my view, like Origen, is embedded in the Christian tradition. His writings came to be thought to be, to a certain degree, indigestible, but nonetheless, they entered the bloodstream to a greater or less degree, depending on where you look in the later tradition. And here I'm talking about the entire tradition, East and West. They are, as far as his specific writings for the monastic life, I'm not a monk, so I can't speak directly to this, but it is my impression that even though Evagrius is subject to ridicule and worse by the later tradition, he is still implanted in that. A sign of that, of course, is the preservation of his work on prayer under the name Nihilus of Ankara. He is that with which the tradition cannot do without, because of the depth of his knowledge, because of the way he brings forward and applies Origen, and because of the way his treatment actually worked. It actually works. There are other versions of this, I think, in other cultures, because they arise out of the observations of the mind itself. Now, theologically, philosophically, he is a Platonist, and he's part of the tradition of John the Scot or Meister Eckhart. He's another one in that broad Platonic tradition. And to some degree, but differently, the Western and Eastern traditions, I mean here Latin and Greek largely, have problems with that, but they can't get along without it. So they usually use some downgraded or less or lower voltage form of Evagrius. And this is a great example of this, of course, is the much venerated writer Maximus the Confessor. That's my 2 cents.
All right. Father Luke, you're next. What is Evagrius's legacy?
This comes primarily from my own concern or my own focus on his scholia on Psalms, but I think Evagrius expands our understanding of what it means to be an exegete, someone who interprets and applies and perceives a deeper meaning in the text, primarily beginning with the biblical text. But what one finds, of course, in the Gnostikos and indeed also in the Praktikos is that the one who learns to interpret the struggle within one's own soul discovers the reality of those same struggles mirrored back in the biblical text with recommendations that enables one then to, well, to the extent that I can read the text in a way that enables me to see Christ in it, that enables me to see Christ in you. It enables me to see Christ in the one who comes to me with their spiritual journey, with their story, which I can then explicate and help them to perceive as part of this ongoing movement towards union with the whole of the divine. So he leaves behind a legacy of the potential for spiritual guidance or accompaniment, as Pope Francis would like to call it today, that's actually very foundational for any Christian relationship.
Joel.
Well, so much as good has already been said. Robin already stole some things I would say. Maximus Confessor as the inheritor and transmitter of the intellectual or metaphysical legacy that Evagrius left behind. And asceticism, it's woven throughout the tradition. He's in the Philokalia, which is the Bible of Eastern Orthodox asceticism and mysticism. There is another legacy in that he started the genre of chapters. The audience may be under the impression that somehow his mode of writing disappeared, but it didn't. And in the chapter that I contributed to Evagrius and his legacy, I provide a table that shows that the genre of chapter writing continued on for more than a millennium, and it invited people to write in gnomic style and to enter into the kinds of thinking that Evagrius himself was doing. Even among somebody like Emperor Leo VI, his particular set of Kephalaia are very puzzling and gnomic indeed, albeit of a different kind of audience and concern. But it's pretty much exactly what Evagrius, I think, was hoping to do, which is to inspire later Christian writers and intellectuals to move in the same mold that he had established.
And I think we should just clarify for a minute, the Philokalia that you're talking about is a later Byzantine monastic text, not the Philokalia of Origen.
Right.
Different text.
Correct.
Charles, you're muted.
Sorry. If I were to answer that question about the legacy of Evagrius from a kind of descriptive point of view, I think the thing I would highlight that hasn't yet been said, so much has been said that's been wonderful, but what I would highlight the Syriac tradition and just say that one way to narrate the legacy of Evagrius is to say that basically the entire Syriac mystical tradition after Evagrius is in some, you can tell that story as if it were an attempt to kind of digest Evagrius, and that tradition stretches from the Mediterranean to China. We have, texts of Evagrius's preserved in a Silk Road oasis town, Dunhuang, or is it Turfan? I can't recall which one. Turfan. So Evagrius is everywhere in that Eastern Christian tradition. But if I permit myself to move out of the descriptive into the normative, I think for myself, I think I'm most interested in precisely the undigestible or the unassimilable quality of Evagrius, specifically the ways in which the monastic tradition, I think, has tried to clip or curtail what I take to be some of the more wild, interesting, and provocative edges of his thinking. And that's what I have found resonates among students. I've taught Evagrius for many, many years. And what continues to fuel my own interest in him.
All right. Father Columba, you're the caboose.
The caboose. Well, I tend to look at legacy with respect to Evagrius through the lenses of translation and then textual transmission. And Charles has touched on the Syriac. I mean, what's interesting is that in the Syriac tradition, there are multiple translations of each fundamental work. And each translator had an agenda, sometimes to correct an earlier translation, which was felt to be ambiguous or unsatisfactory. In other cases, to kind of smooth it out and make it a little more pastoral in approach, a little more practical and applied to the particular circumstances of monastic life. But what's interesting about the Syriac tradition is they preserve almost everything except the Scholia. Now, they preserve the Kephalaia Gnostica and the Gnostikos. Why? Because Origenism was not a live thing for them. Origenism was something in the past. Origen was never translated into Syriac, with very rare exceptions. And so they know that it's a bad thing, but they don't connect it at all to these writings that, as Charles says, become so central to their own spiritual tradition. The other thing is they don't translate the Scholia because the Scholia are tied so closely to the Septuagint Greek translation, which means that everywhere you look, whether it's the Latin and Greek world for reasons that we've touched on, the Syriac world, to a certain extent the Armenian as well, it's not the complete picture. And in a way, working in the early 21st century, as we are, we're getting a more complete picture of Evagrius than really anybody had in the earlier centuries in terms of being able to recoup what survives of the Greek, the Syriac, the Armenian, and so on. So in a way, we have a distorted view of him in terms of the legacy and the influence on the tradition. On the other hand, we might have a shot at a clearer understanding of what his comprehensive project may have been.
Wonderful. Well, this has been a fantastic conversation about a guy I think is incredibly important and puzzles me whenever I read him. But thank you all for a very wonderful and enjoyable conversation.
Thank you, John.
Thank you, John. Thank you, colleagues.
Hi, everybody.
Yes, colleagues. Great to
Thank
see
you,
you all.
everybody.